This is Jeffrey Sachs, editor of Tradition. You're listening to an installment of an engaging series of conversations about issues facing modern Orthodox Judaism around the world. Your host for these conversations is Rabbi Alon Meltzer of Congregation Or Chadash in Sydney, Australia, talking with authors from Tradition's recent Rabbi Norman Lamm Memorial Volume. Visit traditiononline.org to order that volume, sample open access chapters, or subscribe to our Journal of Orthodox Jewish Thought. This series is produced by Or Chadash in cooperation with Tradition. Our thanks to Rabbi Meltzer for his leadership on this initiative. Here's the conversation.
We are extremely excited for the fourth session in our winter series called Modern Orthodoxy, a collaboration between Tradition, Journal for Jewish Thought, and the special memorial edition of in honor of Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm. And tonight we are joined by Rabbi Dr. Stu Halpern. Thank you, Rabbi, for joining us. And thank you, of course, to everyone from across the globe who is here this evening, either on our Zoom or on Facebook or watching the recording. Rabbi Halpern is the senior advisor to the provost of Yeshiva University. He's a senior program officer of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought. He is an accomplished academic across the board with degrees from University of Pennsylvania, from Revel, from Bernard Revel Graduate School, from Azrieli Graduate School at Yeshiva University, and we heard from Dean Rona Novik several weeks ago. So we're going to glean her, I'm sure, within your talk again. Rabbi Halpern is also received smicha from Rabbi Chaim Bravenda. He's the editor of 16 books, a number of different articles, but I wanted to flag two books that are some of my favorites. Firstly, Books of the People, a really incredible book that revisits classical Jewish thought, and perhaps my I even have, I don't say I have a favorite child, I always say I have a second favorite child, so I'm not even going to say, I'm just going to say my second favorite book, but I'm not going to give any hints of whether that's actually accurate. This book, Torah and Western Thought, which looks at a number of different sort of profiles and sort of key thinkings of some of the 20th century's most incredible thinkers within the Jewish world. If you don't have these two books, go out and buy them because they are absolutely astonishing. Tonight, Rabbi Halpern is going to be speaking on the works of Rabbi Lamm's Haggadah and really how we experience the Chagim. And with that, Rabbi Halpern, let me pass it over to you and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be learning with you. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen real quick. I would disclose up front that it's both an honor to be learning with you, as well as an honor to be teaching a little bit of the Torah of my grandfather-in-law. I have the honor of being married to one of Rabbi Lamm's granddaughters, Ahuva Warburg, now Halpern, and it's really incredibly inspiring to the whole family that his Torah is continuing to spread so far and wide across the globe. So I'd like to unpack with you, to unfurl, if you will, Rabbi Lamm on the Seder. Now, why the Seder? Well, we know Shavuot is coming up, and the Shavuot, of course, culminates a process of redemption that we began roughly 45 days ago, give or take, one or two, so 46 days. So with permission, I'd like to jump right in, set the scene a little bit. First, on America, my former country. I'm now coming to you live from the land of Israel, but how Americans, of which, of course, Rabbi Lamm was, have thought about the Passover story, and how he particularly delved deeply into its key themes in his Haggadah commentary, which came out a few years ago, which, of course, in my very, very biased opinion, I highly recommend. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but America has long thought of itself through the prism of the Pesach story. Now, I would love to hear in your tradition in Australia if there's any sort of historical connection, but America has long seen its own story as that of the Jews, the Israelites leaving Mitzrayim. So the very first arrivals on the shores of America actually likened themselves to Moses and the Israelites when they went out of Egypt. Writing in the diary of a leading Puritan thinker was this particular analogy. And a Puritan named John Winthrop, who became the governor of Massachusetts, of course, a major early colony of America, he, on the eve of his departure for New England, said that he felt he was enacting a journey that was similar to how God, quote, carried the Israelites into the wilderness and made them forget the flesh pots of Egypt. And the contemporary journalist Bruce Feiler, who writes often for the New York Times, has actually written an entire book about how the true founding father of the United States of America is Moses, because his story and the story of the Jews leaving Egypt has long informed throughout American history how Americans have seen their own story. Now, even in the modern days, way past the early settlers of America, this story has been told and retold through the eyes of the United States. So behind me, of course, you see Martin Luther King Jr., the famous civil rights leader who described eloquently and often his Moses-like vision of the Promised Land. And back to the New York Times, the writer David Brooks has written, even just a couple of years ago, for most of the past 400 years, Americans did have an overarching story. It was the Exodus story. And it's fascinating to think about what it means for a country to have a shared narrative told throughout time that is not native to its own, but is borrowed from the ancient Israelites, is borrowed from us, is borrowed from Bnei Israel, and has long shaped how the country has viewed itself. And I actually, subsequent to the books that your rabbi was kind enough to mention, for which I greatly appreciate, Rabbi Meltzer, thank you so much. I actually put together a book called Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, which is a source reader of foundational American documents that were inspired by the Tanakh. And we lead you along the American story to demonstrate how American thinkers have constantly turned to Jewish ideas and Hebraic ideas and to Tanakh for inspiration. So, of course, what I want to talk about today is how one modern American thinker, namely my grandfather-in-law, Zechrono Livracha, Rabbi Dr. Rabbi Lamm, how he saw this Pesach story. As an American leader, what uniquely does the story have to teach all of us? Of course, realizing that I'm speaking to people not in America, this story is, of course, I need to tell you, extremely relevant and important to people from all across the globe, and of course has been throughout our story. So the book, which is on screen, was compiled from various drashot that he gave over the course of his rabbinic career. And it was called, per his recommendation, The Royal Table. So he said as follows, said Rabbi Lamm, that over the Seder, participants conduct themselves as victors in the ancient battle, not only with the Egyptians, but with others over the generation who have enslaved us. And this night, we are as if we were sitting at the royal table. Despite our persecutions and misadventures, we're supposed to act as royal men and women, those fit to benefit from a feast of the finest quality. But as we're going to see, this comes with a rather large caveat. Yet, he writes, despite the benefits of this mandated feeling of monarchy, to recline at the table of kings over the Seder night is also something to be done with hesitation, or with almost the opposite feeling. Do not aspire to the royal table, Pirkei Avot cautions us, for your table is greater than theirs. A convert who aspires to join the Jewish people so as to participate in what he or she perceives to be a purely royal national experience, we are told, is of questionable motivation, having expressed, in Rabbi Lamm's words, a crude class consciousness. In other words, we don't normally strive to sit at a table that is exclusive to ourselves, that boxes out others, that seems to lord over other people. And yet the Seder does seem to be at least containing an element of this feeling that we're supposed to have of sitting at a royal table. So this dialectic, this challenge of what it means to live and act royally as Jews, but also to not lord what responsibility we have as God's chosen people over others, is actually the first theme that I want to talk about. In Rabbi Lamm's Haggadah, over and over again, and we're going to review some examples very briefly, he goes to this dialectic, this tension between Pesach as representing royalty and also as inspiring humility. So matzah, he says, for example, matzah can be described as a dialectic itself baked into the unleavened dough. It is a token of divine redemption, our Emancipation Proclamation, which was the name, of course, of the edict from President Abraham Lincoln to free the slaves in America's Civil War. So we emancipate ourselves and we eat this bread or this pseudo bread. But of course, it's also, as we all know, very thin bread, the bread of affliction meant to mirror the crush of servitude. So, writes Rabbi Lamm, the dialectical quality that pervades the entire Seder is universal. This coexistence of antinomies is true of all human life, but especially of the Jewish people, whose story is full of contradictions, of vacillating fortunes, of ups and downs, of apogees and nadirs. In other words, says Rabbi Lamm, throughout his Haggadah commentary, there are ups and downs reflected in the Haggadah. Those ups and downs, of course, are representative of the entirety of Jewish history, and of course, they're representative of how we're supposed to feel. Okay, granted, we're sitting at a table and we're reclining, as we're going to get to, but that comes with a certain level of responsibility. We're reclining with responsibility to the other, including that whom we have defeated. So in his Haggadah commentary, quoting the Tur, he offers a quintessentially fascinating and unique, maybe even humorous drasha. So the Tur explains, in the context of Shabbat Haggadah, that why is it called Shabbat Haggadah, the Shabbat before Pesach? Because a great miracle occurred in that the Egyptians, who considered, we are told, the lamb to be some sort of divine being, they did not attempt to stop the Israelites from bringing the Korban Pesach, bringing the lamb as a sacrifice. But Rabbi Lamm creatively and linguistically reframes the Torah's teaching. The great miracle, argues Rabbi Lamm, a great miracle immortalized by the phrase and the practice of commemorating Shabbat Haggadah, refers not to the silence of the potentially threatening Egyptians, but to the miracle of Jewish character. What we celebrate is not a great miracle, but the miracle of greatness. Okay, so it's a play on words. Shabbat Haggadah is actually celebrating our greatness. What is that greatness, says Rabbi Lamm? Unlike the 10 plagues prior to the bringing of the Korban Pesach, and unlike the subsequent splitting of the sea, Shabbat Haggadah does not actually involve harming our enemies. Shabbat Haggadah actually embodies this value of being able to recline royally, of being able to recognize and to revel in the victory of God, but not have it involve the destruction of others. The Jew rose in stature, but no one was hurt, says Rabbi Lamm. The magic and the miracle of genuine greatness achieved by our people was not at the expense of someone else. It was not at the expense of crushing another human being. Just like in his description of the matzah, this dialectic is at play. So he actually extends this theme number 1, to Avrahams Vision, in which slavery was first alluded to in Chumash, in Sefer Bereshit. Of course, we're told, after the enslavement, the Jews will leave with great wealth. Rabbi Lamm, in another Hasidic-like purposeful mistranslation, which, by the way, you can find often in his drashot. You can actually subscribe. There's the Lamm Archives, Lamm, Lamm Archives of Yeshiva University, and you can sign up to receive 2 drashot from Rabbi Lamm each week. The drashot from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and really incredible rabbinic sermons that are incredibly current even to our own day. And throughout, you'll see this phenomenon of Rabbi Lamm offering his own Hasidic-like drashot. So he says, he translates as, and afterwards they will leave with a wealth of greatness. Rechush gadol, a wealth of greatness. Great wealth, he writes, is an ordinary ambition. Everyone wants to have money in order to live, survive, maybe have a little extra, but a wealth of greatness is the extraordinary Jewish aspiration. Spiritual flourishing, in his view, and in his view of the argument of the Haggadah, is not to rest upon the trampled backs of others. He even extends this line of thinking, this argument about being both royal and responsible, to the Seder's, let's say, number 2 villain. Number 1, of course, coming in is Paro, but number 2 is the Rasha, the wicked son. Says Rabbi Lamm, the wicked son is actually not supposed to be struck down, but rather sympathized with. Even when the Haggadah says that you're supposed to be a hakat shinav, you're supposed to blunt his teeth, he says as follows: the Rasha must never be treated with disdain or enmity. We must approach him with understanding and sympathy. Argue with him, debate with him, teach him, educate him. Okay, so you're blunting his teeth, You're getting in the ring with him, but it should be in a friendly way, friendly, warm, personal relations with him, based upon mutual personal respect and affection, and even love, is what Rabbi Lamm encourages us to do in the context of how we connect to the Rasha. So again and again, he pounds away at this theme of how we are to take this royal lesson of the Seder. It is not that we are the best and we're just supposed to revel in how much greater and how more chosen we are than others, and how we're saved by God to the exclusion of everyone else. This couldn't be farther from what Rabbi Lamm sees the Haggadah is trying to argue. It's actually arguing for a certain ethic worldview, the morality of what it means, what responsibility comes with the great power of our Passover story. He also reads this theme when it comes into the story of borrowing, quote unquote, Sha'al, borrowing from the Egyptians goods on the way out of Mitzrayim. So there's actually a point of contention historically, even ad hayom hazeh, to this day. There's actually every few years, and you're welcome to Google this, a lawsuit brought, or an attempted lawsuit brought, usually by Arabs in Egypt, an attempt to sue the Jews for the utensils that we took out of Mitzrayim on our way out of our enslavement. I'm not making this up. You can actually search for it. There was around 10 years ago or so, the Times of Israel wrote about it, an attempt to sue the Jews for the gold and silver and the clothes that we asked for on the way out. Now, of course, our defense, this is not, by the way, from Rabbi Lamm's Haggadah, but this is just as an FYI, our defense, of course, against the charge of having stolen these goods is that these are, of course, payment for the years of Shibud Mitzrayim. And Alan Dershowitz, a famous American lawyer from Harvard University, has actually volunteered to defend the Jews against this terrible lawsuit over the quote-unquote stolen Egyptian gold. So rest assured, all will be okay. We're not on the hook for it. And actually the Gemara, there's a Gemara whereby the Egyptians go to Alexander the Great and try to claim or reclaim payments due for these materials. And the story plays out exactly as it is done in modern days, whereby the defender of the Jews actually says, well, if you pay us for all the years of Shibud Mitzrayim, then let's call it a day, because we don't owe you anything. And so ayin sham, as we say. But rather, argues Rabbi Lamm, that what was borrowed was not actually unethical spoils of war, but rather we learn for all time how to be righteous and compassionate towards all victims of oppression and persecution and adversity. As a result of getting these gifts from the Egyptians, we learned how to treat the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. A lesson of this sort is greater than any redemption. In other words, what Rabbi Lamm sees is the Egyptians being asked to give these materials to the Jews as they depart is a sign of chesed. It was meant to represent, it was meant to signal that as we go forth on our own travels, even if we're just emerging from hardship and difficulty, we must think of the other and what we can give to them. Even our own posture, even how we physically move our bodies at the Seder is a reflection of this theme that we've been discussing. So of course we recline, as we all know, and we do so as the Romans did. The Romans, of course, would have the tradition of reclining on couches and eating grapes, as we've all seen in the movies or read about. But we do this in a way that actually hoists them on their own petard in a way. I mean, the Romans were, of course, a historical enemy of the Jews, and they're effectively no longer, and they're no longer players on the world stage. But we adapt their position of leisure. And we demonstrate that we ourselves are royal, like the Romans used to be, but we do so in a way that's tinged with bitterness, right? We, of course, eat korech, the sandwich, with maror and with charoset. And they remind us, as Rabbi Lamm points out, that life is often sweet, but is also often bitter. That misery is not meaningless, that pain is not pointless punishment, that human anguish has larger dimension, and that the bitter leads to the sweet. The entirety of the Seder experience, says Rabbi Lamm, becomes a check against this haughty and heady posturing of a liberty that is exclusive and indifferent to those less free. The Romans, as we see behind me, of course, embody this feeling that there's a cultural elite, there's a legal elite, there's a political elite, there's a financial elite, and they are meant to recline while all else is enslaved to them. And this is contrasted with the posture that we are supposed to hold in our own Seder experience. Now, I don't know if this made it to your shores, but in America around 2 years ago, there was a letter, as I imagine is not dissimilar to your own national politics. Unfortunately, this just seems to be how the world is operating these days. People tend to hate each other, particularly on social media, and tend to fight. And there's there's the good team that, of course, is the team you're on, and the bad team that is, of course, possessing opinions that you don't agree with. So around 2 years ago, there was a letter, an open letter from a magazine called Harper's, calling for a more tolerant American public square. And of course, the letter met with its own negative feedback, as you would expect, because even calls for civil dialogue nowadays tend to unfortunately be caught up in controversy or accused of trying to shout down others or be biased in some way. Well, nonetheless, in this letter, Thomas Chatterton Williams, one of its authors, wrote as follows: "Genuine positive equality," he wrote, "can only be achieved through mutual security, which requires maximum tolerance and freedom. The boundary between the infinite and infinitely judgmental internet agora, where individuals become ideas, epithets, avatars of virtue or stigma, to be celebrated, right, they're the ones on your team, or cast out on the other team, and our local physical lives has eroded." Right? The digital thunderdome of the internet actually has come to mirror real life and the overly harsh fights and interactions we have for those who are different. Long a crusader against racism, against painting one side as inherently different or less than. And there's an article about Rabbi Lamm's anti-racism on the website The Lair House, which I highly recommend you to check out. Rabbi Lamm saw the Jewish concept of freedom as a collaborative project. In other words, if you're supposed to take your being at a royal table, you're supposed to take living in a covenantally inspired society, then we are not supposed to lord that feeling, that sense of purpose over others. It is an unceasing task that Haggadah reminds us over and over to achieve lasting, peaceful, and mutually beneficial societal cohesion, absent subjugating others. Liberty is not an excuse, writes Rabbi Lamm, to be free to insult, free to be rude, free to ridicule religion, country, and democracy itself, and ultimately free to burn and to loot. That is not what liberty is about. Now, it's transitioning to the second of Rabbi Lamm's key elements of his Haggadah commentary, is that the Jewish tradition holds out for us the promise of eventual societal redemption through the observance of the mitzvah. That the Constitution, if you will, the key legal elements, the key to our staying together as a nation and bringing our own redemption and the redemption of others, is through being Mekayim the mitzvah. So in a rather sharp polemic that I highly recommend by a renowned playwright named David Mamet, there is a great example of this, this key focus on how being an affiliated Jew is actually so much anchored in Taryag mitzvot. So he writes as follows in his book, named, of course, I'm inspired by the wicked son at the Seder, who we've already discussed. So Mamet writes as follows: "To the wicked son who asks, what does this all mean to you? To the Jews who in the 60s envied the Black Power movement, who in the 90s envied the Palestinians, who weep at Exodus but jeer at the IDF, who nod when Tevye praises tradition but fidget through the Seder, who might take their curiosity to a dogfight, to a bordello, or an opium den, but find ludicrous the notion of a visit to the synagogue, whose favorite Jew is Anne Frank and whose second favorite does not exist, who are humble in their desire to learn about Kwanzaa and proud of their ignorance of Tu B'Shvat, who dread endogamy more than incest, who bow the head reverently at a baptism and have never attended a bris. To you," he's writing to Jews, these types of Jews, "to you who find your race and religion repulsive, your ignorance of your history a satisfaction, here is a book from your brother," writes David Mamet. So decades before, Rabbi Lamm was making a similar argument that the key to a living, breathing, covenantal Jewish community, to one that is meaningful, to one that is actually Jewish, is observance of the mitzvot, which the Seder, of course, emphasizes. Crucial. We must, Rabbi Lamm wrote, go beyond history, beyond theology, beyond philosophy, and explaining what Judaism really is.
Because after all, every religion has its beautiful concept, its stories, its ideas, its tales, its leading thinkers. If we are honest, and we must be, we must emphasize, he said, that which is unique to Judaism. And that is, of course, the practical mitzvot. That is, of course, our observance of halacha. When we respond to the wicked son by saying, because of this, God took me out of Egypt, what we mean to convey is that tradition is our way of orienting to our God. It is that which sensitizes us spiritually, which opens us to eternity and to the timeless. It is not a way of commemorating the past, but of using the past as a pretext for living in the present meaningfully. In order to live a meaningful Jewish existence, of course, it involves observing God's divinely given commandments. In that sense, it might very well be, says Rabbi Lamm, that the Tam, the simpleton, is actually the real hero among the Arba Banim. After all, he does not attempt to boast of his learning by asking questions that are going to sound very clever, very impressive, but he expresses a simple and a whole love of God and submission to him. He does so by preferring heart to mind and faith over philosophy. Commenting on the book of Exodus's observation that he who did not put his heart to the word of God, those who did not think that these plagues were actually going to happen and the Makot were going to strike, left out their cattle and slaves outdoors to be slain by the Barad. Rabbi Lamm turns what seems to be this rather minor passing reference to the Egyptian scoffing into a statement about the very purpose of humanity. Indifference, in his view, is the cardinal sin of mankind, setting his sights on his own Jewish community. And this, of course, applies to all of us, independent of where we live. He lamented that we don't put our hearts into his service. By punning off of the pasuk, he who did not put his heart to the word of God, which was said about the Egyptians, Rabbi Lamm warns about being true about us. Are we really putting our hearts into our divine service? Asked Rabbi Lamm. The sins of his generation, he felt, were not anger against God nor rebellion against Torah, but rather apathy. We do not desecrate the Shabbat because we dislike it. We are just religiously phlegmatic. And I think this warning, this word of caution, is no less true, maybe even more true in our own age, where there's so much that can make us so easily apathetic. We're constantly, of course, attached to our phones. There's always a new great show on Netflix. And of course, I'm speaking about myself here. There's always a temptation to be apathetic. Do we really need to get up and go to that extra minute? Do we really need to learn that extra mission? And the key, of course, is the taking inspiration from the story of Pesach and remembering that what gives us the responsibility and the opportunity to sit at the royal table is, of course, our observance of the mitzvot and our listening to God's commandments and being proactive in doing so. Our faith should be an optimistic one, eliciting us the hard work of doing this, of keeping these mitzvot, ceaseless dedication and endless effort towards fulfilling the laws of the Torah. We should not hesitate. We must, as Rabbi Lamm said, take our Jewish identity as natural and not, like in that quote, decades after he wrote these words from David Mamet, not apologize for who we are and what we're meant to take pride in. Like the Midrash about Nachshon ben Aminadav leading the way into the raging sea, we can be both deliberate and dynamic, considering the risks, but then we commit ourselves wholeheartedly. We jump in to the destiny of Judaism by keeping the mitzvah. Now, of course, we're very, very close, as I mentioned, to the culmination of this 49-day journey from the second night of Pesach until Shavuot. And Rabbi Lamm notes in his commentary that we make a literal accounting through our accounting of Sfirat HaOmer, of our ascension to this higher plane of observing the mitzvot, of accepting them once more, of transcending our own regular, often apathetic lives to the level of obeying the divine precepts. By manifesting our Jewish destiny through observing halacha and committing ourselves to its values, we, quote, offer an alternative to the world, to speak the word of God and Torah in the great spiritual abyss, to remain critical of local idolatries, whether it's racism, whether it's worship of social media as somehow reflective of our real selves, whether it is thinking ourselves as grander than others. We must speak the authentic word of Torah on the great issues of the day, fearlessly, courageously, and honestly. Even in times, he wrote, even in times that are difficult and tense, we must be able to sing. That Pesach is supposed to inspire in us, and we're counting up to Shavuot, which is coming, of course, at the end of the week. That we are supposed to count up in a way that is joyous while carrying our responsibility to live covenantally. That is a real test, to sing of your Jewishness, even when you sing alone, to be content in your Jewishness, even when the world is alienated from you, to laugh at despair and banish it from your life. To be a Jew means to sing. In other words, as we bring our proud Jewish identity, as we bring our observance of the mitzvot into the public square, into our communities, of course, into our homes, and into our own hearts, it's important to do so joyfully. So much of the Seder is, of course, so much of Pesach is about singing, Hallel, is about hearing the song Az Yashir on the seventh day, is, of course, singing the numerous tunes that we have passed down from generation to generation, because this responsibility we have to the world and to ourselves and to our own religious identity and affiliation is, of course, not one that is meant to be held and carried somberly, but is meant to be held joyously. It is meant to be sung. Though it may often be lyrical, the properly committed Jewish life is not meant to be insular. It's not meant to be exclusive, as we've been discussing. It's not meant to box people out, but rather to bring people in. And it's also not to be one that involves cutting corners. It actually involves, as we know, as we're all aware, because we learned together, deep diligence and constant commitment. Rabbi Lamm noted how moderns, and he's writing 50, 60, even 70 years ago, okay, way before the internet, way before there was Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. He said that we are too easy when it comes to, we are too inclined to worship at the shrine of the shortcut, too often desiring easy and quick triumphs. We so easily go to whatever is quick and fast, that gets our point across or that entertains us. But our presence at the Seder, which, of course, spoiler alert, is anything but fast, is anything but easy. And even when you're a young child, you're expected to be at the Seder table for as long as you can last, trying to participate and have the challenge of sharing and listening to Divrei Torah. Our presence at the Seder, our participation in this night is suffused with melodic meaning. It expresses the very essence of the assiduous Jewish project itself, of how challenging it is, what this responsibility entails, to be at the Seder and to live proudly as a Jew. It reminds us to attend to children, to husband and wife, and to friends in a manner that is more involved, more engaging, more enduring, and more concerned. It challenges us, does the Seder night, to make our observance of the mitzvot, and particularly prayer, warmer and livelier, deeper and more intense. It inspires us, it inspires in us a commitment to Judaism that is more personal, more significant, and more determined. In one of his great works, the renowned poet T.S. Eliot wrote as follows: "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." This, of course, is what happens on Pesach, and is, of course, what happens on Shavuot. When we arrive again at Har Sinai, we arrive again in this process from Pesach to Shavuot, to go back to where we started. Rabbi Lamm, by offering a reading of the Haggadah that is characteristically brilliant in its exegetical insight, and again, I know I'm biased, please forgive me, but please check out more of his drashot online for his plays on words, for his eloquence of language, and of course, for his brilliant insights into our tradition and into our treasured text. Pesach's unapologetic call to action in Rabbi Lamm's reading offers us a clear vision for the ceaseless exploration of going out into our lives each day as observant and proud and responsible Jews, but doing so in a way that harkens back to where it all began. So to conclude, Rabbi Lamm's Haggadah, in his wonderful work, The Royal Table, argues two major points. One is that we must possess this value of royal humility, this constant vacillation, as we saw all sorts of examples, whether it was the wicked son, whether it was the borrowing of items from the Egyptians, whether it was the matzah, whether it was the very reclining itself, how we're supposed to balance in our role as the chosen people, the confidence of freedom and the modesty of servitude. And of course, how in order to be truly loyal, and in order to truly understand and take meaning from the sights, sounds, and songs of the Seder into our lives, emerging from the place where it all began, to return to it every year, is of course through a renewed and passionate Jewish observance, of course, for keeping of mitzvot and participating, as you all are doing now, in lived, proud Jewish communities of Torah observance, of being in the community of an incredible, incredible Rav, and learning together. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Really an honor and a pleasure, and I so appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Halpern. Before I continue with a couple of questions, if you've got any questions, please put them into the chat box, and we can hopefully facilitate a bit of a conversation. I just wanted to jump in. Let's go back a step. That was incredible. You know, Rabbi Lamm's Haggadah is a staple on my lap. Usually about 3 or 4 going at any one time, but Rabbi Lamm's is always there next to me. And I feel his words are constantly timeless, and they just evoke so much emotion and sort of pushed for transformative action. So to hear you speak about them in such a way is just incredible. I really loved how you looked at Rabbi Lamm's words and commentary as really explaining the Pesach as a catalyst for change, for transformative change, into whether it's mitzvot observance or an understanding of the world around us. And I've always, been thinking, obviously the Torah tells us that the Korban Pesach had to be brought as family units, but the Seder itself could, like nowadays, could really just be a giant shul meal, but still it's done in the family. And I wonder if that family idea where change really happens that's why it's at the family. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, it all emerges from the family, and Rabbi Lamm, of course, emphasizes this throughout. And I think the idea, and it's really incredible to see the parenting. I think you could do a whole book on Rabbi Lamm on parenting, but to see his drashot of how over and over again, whether it's at the Seder, whether it's in shul, the key element, of course, in Jewish continuity is bringing your children to synagogue, encouraging them with the right values, and how Dafka, particularly and he has an incredible point on this with regard to the Romans, we specifically include our children in the Seder. Now, the Romans, if you recall, they were the elite. They were boxing out anyone who wasn't as wealthy as them. The idea of children being there to ask questions is so foreign to the concept of being at the reclining Roman table. But it's a key element, the key element, as Rabbi Lamm writes, in our Haggadah observance. And the idea that Jewish continuity is only to be ensured by the involvement of children is something that is so core to his reading of the Seder, and of course to all of Jewish practice. And so absolutely spot on.
And springboarding from that, obviously we've had 7 weeks moving from Pesach to Shavuot, and Shavuot is this sort of paradigm shift within our national story, from moving from slavery into true freedom, which is under the yoke of heaven. How do we take those messages of transformative change from Pesach and that sort of that idealism of trying to grow in our mitzvot to full acceptance when it comes to Shavuot?
So it's a fascinating question. So I think, of course we have sort of the practice of acknowledging some sort of a Kabbalistic midot when it comes to a Stuart HaOmer. Some of us mentioned, Gvura Shebachesed and the like other characteristics of God. So whether those personally resonate with you, or whether this is an opportunity to reflect upon what is an element of my Judaism that I could be more proactive about. What is a midah, a measurement of practice? Maybe it's something that I can go a little bit of the extra mile on to do. I think Stuart HaOmer is a perfect opportunity to do so, to build on our practice. Now, we, of course, I don't know if they have New Year's resolutions in Australia, but in America, there's like a big thing, New Year's resolution. So we don't have one day where we're all going to take on something. And then of course, we sign up for that gym membership and then we never go. But now we have a 49-day opportunity to really reinvigorate. And this is a theme, of course, that Rabbi Lamm emphasizes over and over, that Pesach is about reinvigoration. This period to Shavuot is about reinvigoration. Is there something where we can take that extra step, take on that extra measure of mitzvot, or learning, or taking on, the extra 5 minutes a day, or do that daf, or even if you're 27 dafim behind, or a mesachah and a half behind, 7.5 years is a long time. You got plenty of time to catch up, and it starts today. And so, and maybe daf yomi is too much of a reach, and it's making that extra bracha, or remembering to say asher yatzar when you come out of the bathroom. But now is a great time. Now is a great time, as we're soon to be standing together before God in Har Sinai. to use this opportunity of Stuart to build our own religious commitment. Absolutely.
And my final question to you is really, we learned last week from Rabbi Sachs, the editor of Tradition, about the process of creating this journal. And obviously you've had an inside view as being part of the mishpacha, more probably than most. In fact, I remember one of our speakers in a few weeks, Rabbi Hess, I don't think had very much interaction at all with Rabbi Lamm until this project. But you've obviously had an inside seat at the table. You were at the royal table, as it were. What does it mean to you to write this article and to have this text specifically, to have his Haggadah to comment on and to explore?
Thank you so much for the question. So it was particularly meaningful. I was lucky enough to be at a few Sedarim with Rabbi Lamm, and it's very surreal to be using Haggadah when of course he was still alive, and to have that is really just I mean, the Haggadah was put together by an editor, of course based on his drashot, but to see the joy, even when he had retired from teaching and from speaking publicly, to see the joy that his family, and goes back to your earlier question, his family was sitting around the table using his insights. It was really immeasurable. And just being able to, we actually collected his Drashot on Chumash in a series called Drashot L'Dorot that I think you could just sort of get up and read from Shabbat to Shabbat. And whether you're American or Australian or wherever you're from, or Israeli, his insights continue to inspire. And the other day, actually, a family member shared that I think it was an essay about morality, if I'm not mistaken, and it was a Reform rabbi. He posted on Facebook. Did anyone ever see this drasha from Rabbi Lamm from 1961? Like, he covers everything there is to know about the morals of this particular issue. So it's wild. The other day I was talking to someone about actually space exploration, and are there what would be the religious implications of extraterrestrial life? And as you're probably aware, Rabbi Lamm wrote about this 50 years ago, and he was actually interviewed for the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey as one of the theologians that was meant to offer some religious insights into this. That was unfortunately cut from the movie, but he was exploring all sorts of topics that are continuing to be relevant as technology advances. And Rabbi Lamm, as we saw in this small snippet here about our attention shortcuts, he continues to speak and to inspire, even following his passing a couple of years ago.
Great, Rabbi, thank you so much for giving us of your time. It really is a tremendous zchut for us to be able to learn from you. I know that I was in Eretz Yisrael over the last week, and I saw, I think from RIETS, the rabbinic seminary that I went to, Yeshiva University's Smicha program, put out a post that Rav Lamm and his late wife were reinterred in Eretz Yisrael this past week. So to hear from you as a member of his family in this time is really, really incredible. We are really fortunate to have had you join us and to share such beautiful words and incredible Torah around Rabbi Lamm's thoughts of Pesach, and how that one day, one moment of our Jewish cycle is really the foundational element of our national story, of our past, present, and future.